The first mare stopped chewing before the old woman reached the gate. Then a gelding lifted his head. Then 32 horses turned at once toward the road. They ignored the fresh hay. They ignored the men calling from the corrals. And when the stranger was told there was no work for someone her age, the entire remuda began walking after her. Not running, not frightened, just following the woman the ranch had forgotten. In October of 1908, the Sangre de Cristo foothills were the color of old brass. Frost silvered the bunchgrass before sunrise, and the cottonwoods along the Mora River dropped yellow leaves into the irrigation ditches. Mesa Verde Horse Ranch sat above the valley on 600 hard acres of piñon, pasture, and red dirt. Its horses were known from Santa Fe to Trinidad for one thing above all else: they did not panic easily. That morning a woman named Ruth Calder came up the ranch road carrying a bedroll, a canvas bag, and a saddle blanket folded over one arm. She was 69 years old. Time had narrowed her shoulders, but it had not bent them. Her skin was weathered dark by decades of sun. Her gray hair braided beneath a flat-crowned black hat, and her hands looked like they had been carved from the same cedar as the gateposts. A patched wool coat hung over a faded work dress, and the heels of her boots had been rebuilt more than once. She carried no letter of recommendation, only a small brass whistle on a leather cord. Near the main barn, Clara Bell was arguing with a feed merchant over figures written in a ledger. Clara had inherited Mesa Verde after her father died the previous spring. At 33, she knew how to foal a mare, set a fence brace, and bargain for hay. What she did not know was how to make one thin winter reserve cover a leaking barn roof, a banknote, and 57 horses. Her foreman, Everett Shaw, stood beside her in a tailored riding coat that had never met a nailhead. Everett was 38, broad-shouldered, handsome, and certain that every horse problem could be solved with a stronger bit and another man on the rope. Ruth stopped several paces away and removed her hat. "Morning." Clara looked up. Ruth said, "I heard you might need hands before winter." Everett glanced at the bedroll, then at Ruth's face. "A cook, maybe?" Ruth did not look at him. "I work horses." That drew laughter from 2 young riders near the tack room. Everett smiled as though she had offered him a joke. "You break them?" "No." His smile widened. "Then what do you do?" Ruth placed her hat against her chest. "I teach them not to need breaking." The laughter faded for half a second. Then Everett gave a low whistle. "That sounds expensive." Clara studied Ruth's hands. They were scarred, steady, and clean around the nails, despite the road dust. "How long have you worked with horses?" 51 years. One of the riders muttered, "That horse ought to be collecting a pension." A few men laughed. Ruth waited. Clara did not join them, but her eyes moved to the hay wagon, the cracked water trough, and the men already carrying more work than they could finish. "This ranch is rough in winter," she said. "Ice on the north pens, long days, heavy gates. I can't put someone in danger because I'm short-handed. You think I'm too old. I think the work can kill a strong person." Ruth nodded once. It was not anger in her face. That would have been easier for Clara to bear. It was recognition. She had heard this answer before. "I understand," Ruth said. "Thank you for saying it plain." She put on her hat, turned, and walked back toward the road. Everett called after her, "Try the hotel in town. They might let you fold sheets." The youngest mare beside the fence stopped eating, her ears fixed on Ruth. A sorrel gelding turned from the trough. Across the lower pasture, another horse raised its head, then another. In less than 10 seconds, every animal in the field stood facing the same direction. The ranch hands noticed one by one. Hammering stopped. A wagon chain went still. Even Everett lowered his smile. Ruth had reached the outer gate when the first mare began to walk. No one had opened the pasture, no one had shaken grain. The mare simply crossed the field toward the fence line nearest Ruth. The others followed in a widening stream: bays, roans, grays, 2 nursing mares, 3 yearlings, and old Capitan, the ranch's 24-year-old led gelding. 32 horses moved together without crowding or breaking into a trot. Ruth heard the hoofbeats and stopped. She did not turn immediately. Instead, she lifted the small brass whistle from beneath her coat. She did not blow it. She only held it in her palm. Old Capitan reached the fence first. His muzzle went over the top rail. Ruth stepped close enough for him to smell her sleeve. The gelding breathed in. Then he lowered his head. Ruth touched 2 fingers to the white crescent above his left eye. Capitan closed both eyes. Behind him, the pasture filled with horses waiting in silence. Clara came down the slope slowly. "What did you do?" "Nothing. They followed you. They followed something they know." Everett snorted. "They know hay. Search her bag." Ruth handed him the canvas sack without protest. Inside were 2 shirts, a whetstone, a sewing kit, half a loaf of bread, and a bundle of letters tied with blue thread. No oats, no sugar, no apple. Everett dropped the bag into the dust. Ruth picked it up, brushed it clean, and looked toward Capitan again. Clara asked, "Have you been here before?" A long pause settled between them. "Yes." "When?" "Before you were born." Clara's expression changed. Ruth looked beyond the barn toward the old stone foaling shed half hidden by cottonwoods. "I worked Mesa Verde when the north pasture had no fence and the barn roof was cedar shake. Your grandfather hired me in 1871. Clara stared at her. "That was 37 years ago. 37 years and 4 months. Everett folded his arms. "None of these horses were alive then." "No," Ruth said, "but the ranch still speaks the same language." She raised 2 fingers. Capitan stepped back from the fence. She lowered her hand. He stepped forward. Then Ruth shifted her weight and turned one shoulder. The old gelding quietly moved his hindquarters away, exactly as if a halter rope had guided him. Clara watched the movement twice before she understood. "Our handlers use that signal." "I know. You taught it?" Ruth looked at the brass whistle in her palm. "I helped build the system." Clara hired her for 7 days, not as charity, not yet as trust, as a test. Everett objected until Clara reminded him whose name was on the banknote. Ruth asked for a bunk in the empty foaling shed, 2 meals a day and the same wages as the youngest rider. "You should ask for more," Clara said. "I will when I've earned more." By noon, Ruth was repairing a gate hinge with rawhide instead of replacing it with iron they could not afford. By afternoon, she had found a stone bruise in a mare everyone else had called lazy. Before supper, she showed one of the younger riders why his nervous gelding kept pulling away from the left side. "You reach for his face before you let him see your hand," she said. "He knows me. He knows what you do." The rider tried again, slower this time. The gelding stayed. Ruth nodded. "That's the beginning." Clara's 12-year-old daughter, Nell, watched from the fence. Nell had inherited her mother's dark eyes and her grandfather's habit of asking questions faster than people could answer them. "Mrs. Calder, Ruth will do. Why did all the horses follow you? They didn't follow me." "They did, everyone saw." Ruth sat on an overturned bucket and began cleaning mud from a hoof pick. "They followed." A pause. Nell frowned. Ruth held up the tool. "Most people walk at a horse already wanting something. A rope, a saddle, a faster step, a quiet mouth. Horses learn the pressure before the person even reaches them. And you don't want anything?" "Oh, I want plenty." Nell smiled. "But I ask after they know they can say no." The girl thought about that. "So the pause is a question?" Ruth looked pleased. "Exactly. Over the next 3 days, the ranch changed by inches. Men stopped cornering young horses in the training pen. They learned to leave one side open. They stopped jerking lead ropes when fear tightened a horse's neck. They learned Ruth's sequence: approach, breathe, wait, ask. It was not magic. It was slower than force for the first 5 minutes, and faster for every minute after that. The proof stood in the North Corral. His name was Ash. He was a black stallion with a torn right ear, a white heel, and a reputation that had outgrown the truth. 2 years earlier, a gate had slammed against him during a windstorm. Since then, he struck at anyone carrying a long rope and charged the boards when trapped. Everett called him vicious. Ruth watched him for 20 minutes and said, "He's not trying to win." "What is he trying to do?" Clara asked. "Find the door before the door hurts him." Everett laughed. "A horse doesn't remember a gate." Ruth looked at him. "Then why does he only fight when you close one?" That afternoon, Everett gathered half the ranch to prove her wrong. He entered Ash's pen with a heavy halter and 2 men holding flank ropes. The stallion backed until his hindquarters struck the boards. His head rose. The whites of his eyes flashed. Ruth stood outside the gate. "Open the far panel," she said. Everett ignored her. Ash struck once. A rope snapped tight. The stallion reared, twisted, and came down against the fence hard enough to split a rail. Nell gasped. Clara shouted, "Stop!" Everett swore and pulled harder. Ruth moved before anyone else did. She opened the far panel. Then she stepped into the pen with empty hands. Ash saw the opening behind her. His body changed. Not calm yet, but no longer trapped. Ruth turned sideways and lowered her eyes. "Let go," she said. Everett stared at her. "Let go before you teach him he was right." Clara ordered the men to release the ropes. Ash backed toward the open panel. He could have run into the pasture. He did not. Ruth waited. 1 minute passed, then 2. The stallion's breathing slowed. Ruth touched the brass whistle at her chest and gave 3 soft notes. Ash's ears came forward. A ranch hand whispered, "He knows that." Ruth took one step. Ash stayed. She took another. He lowered his head by an inch. By the time she reached him, no one in the yard was laughing. Ruth did not touch his face. She placed her hand against the thick muscle of his shoulder, far from the injured ear, and stood there until the stallion let out a breath that shook dust from his nostrils. Nell whispered, "Did she tame him?" Clara answered without looking away. "No, she gave him a door." That night, Everett found Ruth hanging the broken ropes in the tack room. "You embarrassed me," Ruth continued, coiling leather. "Ash did not know we were competing. You made me look cruel. You closed the gate." Everett stepped closer. "This ranch needs discipline, not campfire wisdom." Ruth hung the last rope on its peg. "This ranch needs winter hay." The words landed harder than an insult. Everett's jaw tightened. Ruth had seen the ledger on Clara's desk. She had seen the merchant leave without unloading the second wagon. She had seen men patching a roof with flour sacks beneath the shingles. Everett lowered his voice. "I can bring money into this place." "At what price? That is not your concern. It becomes my concern when the horses are the price." He smiled without warmth. 7 days, Mrs. Calder, then you go back to the road. On the 5th day, the first winter storm came early. Clouds sealed the mountains before noon. The temperature fell 20 degrees in an hour, and sleet began clicking against the barn windows. 30 horses were still grazing in the upper basin beyond a narrow timber cut. Usually, 2 riders could bring them down before dark. That day, the herd refused to enter the cut. A lightning strike from the previous summer had left a charred pine leaning above the trail. In rising wind, the trunk groaned and swung over the horses like a closing gate. Everett sent 4 riders to push them through. The herd bunched. A mare slipped on rock, another wheeled downhill. Within minutes, the remuda scattered across the basin. Clara stood in the yard listening to the wind. "If they stay up there tonight, the foals will freeze." Everett tightened his cinch. "We'll drive them hard." Ruth came from the barn wearing her patched coat. "No," he turned, "you are not in charge." "No," Ruth said, "the weather is." Thunder rolled over the ridge. Ruth looked at Clara. "How many riders can hear one another in that cut?" "None once the wind rises." "How many horses know the 3-note call?" Clara looked toward Capitan. "All of them, I think." "The wranglers use it at feed time." "Not feed time," Ruth said. "Home." She mounted a small dun mare named Cricket. No one had offered her the horse. The mare had walked to Ruth while the men were saddling. Nell caught Ruth's stirrup. "You can't ride up there." Ruth looked down at the girl. "I've ridden worse weather. That was when you were younger." A smile touched Ruth's face. "So was the weather." She rode into the sleet. Clara followed. So did 2 ranch hands. Everett hesitated, then came last. The upper basin had become a gray bowl of moving rain. Horses appeared and vanished behind curtains of sleet. The leaning pine cracked above the trail. Each time it shifted, the herd surged away from the cut. Everett shouted, "Circle them from the west!" Ruth shook her head. "Pressure sends them toward the cliff." "Then what?" Ruth dismounted. She walked alone to the mouth of the timber cut. The wind pushed her coat against her legs. Ice caught in her braid. Behind her, 30 frightened horses milled across open rock. She put the brass whistle to her lips. 3 notes disappeared into the storm. Nothing happened. Everett shouted, "Again." Ruth waited. The pause was the question. She blew 3 notes a second time. Somewhere in the gray, Capitan answered with a low call. A shape emerged. The old gelding walked toward her, not because the path was safe, because Ruth was standing in it without asking him to hurry. 1 mare followed Capitan, then a yearling, then 6 more. The herd began to form behind him. Ruth stepped backward into the timber cut. Capitan came after her. Each time the pine groaned, she stopped. Each time the horses settled, she moved again. Clara watched the entire remuda enter the narrow trail, 1 animal at a time. No ropes, no shouting, no chase. Only 3 whistle notes. A woman walking backward through sleet and horses choosing to place their feet where she had placed hers. Halfway down, the charred pine split. The upper trunk crashed across the trail behind the last mare. Cricket bolted sideways. Nell's favorite foal, a 6-month-old gray called Button, slipped beneath the falling branches and vanished into brush. Clara screamed his name. Everett tried to force his horse around the trunk. Ruth was already on the ground. She crawled beneath the broken limbs while sleet rattled through the needles. Button lay in a shallow wash, trapped by a branch across his hind legs. His eyes rolled. Each struggle drove the wood deeper into the mud. Ruth knelt near his head. "Easy." The foal thrashed. Ruth did not grab him. She breathed, waited, asked. His eye found hers. His body stopped fighting for 1 second. That second was enough. Clara and Everett lifted the branch. Ruth guided the foal free. When he rose, shaking and cut along one hock, he pressed his small forehead against Ruth's shoulder. Then Ruth tried to stand, her right leg folded beneath her. The old woman had taken the weight of the branch across her hip. She had hidden it until the foal was clear. The riders carried her down in a wagon after dark. The herd followed the wagon all the way to the barn. Ruth woke the next morning in Clara's spare room. Her hip was badly bruised, not broken. The doctor ordered 2 weeks without riding. Ruth asked for her boots. Clara refused. You saved the herd. Competence saved the herd. You saved Button. The foal stopped fighting. You could have been killed. Ruth looked toward the window. Ash stood outside in the sleet, facing the house. So could he. Clara sat beside the bed. Why did you leave Mesa Verde? For the first time since arriving, Ruth's composure shifted. Her hand closed around the blanket. My husband Daniel worked the East Range. We had a boy named Thomas. He was 9. Clara waited. Diphtheria came through the valley in the winter of 1871. It took both of them in 6 days. I stayed until spring. Every stall door, every trail, every supper bell sounded like someone who was not coming back. Her voice thinned but did not break, so I left before grief could turn the place cruel. Where did you go? Everywhere horses were handled badly. A sad smile crossed her face. Texas cattle stations, Army remount yards, mining camps, a stage line in Arizona. I kept thinking one more job would make me ready to come home. And did it? Ruth looked through the glass at Ash waiting in the yard. No, Clara understood. Home had not become easier. Ruth had simply become tired of avoiding it. That afternoon, while Ruth slept, Clara climbed into the loft above the old stone foaling shed. She was looking for a dry cradle to carry feed sacks. Instead, behind a stack of warped stall doors, she found a cedar box blackened by age. Inside were breeding ledgers, veterinary notes, and thin sheets of paper covered in hand-drawn diagrams. Approach from the shoulder. Leave the horse in open line. Breathe before pressure. 3 notes mean home. 2 notes mean water. 1 note means stand. At the bottom of nearly every page were the initials R.C. Clara read until sunset. One ledger recorded a winter fever that swept through the ranch in 1873. Ruth had organized rotating watches and saved 14 of 19 foals. Another described 2 foundation mares, Lark and Mercy, selected not for speed but for steady nerves and willingness around children. A later breeding chart showed their lines spreading across the valley. Clara carried the books to the kitchen table and compared the old brands with the current registry. 26 of Mesa Verde's 57 horses descended directly from Lark or Mercy. Another 19 had been trained by handlers using Ruth's signals. The ranch's famous calm was not a legend. It was a system, and that system had been earning Mesa Verde money for 37 years. No deed carried Ruth's name, no photograph hung in the office, no one had even kept her bed, but her work was in the horses. The next morning, Everett arrived with a banker from Las Vegas, New Mexico, and a contract folded inside his coat. Clara met them on the porch. Everett spoke gently. The storm damage makes the decision simple. Sell me the breeding herd. I'll assume the note, keep you in the house through spring, and spare you a foreclosure. Clara looked at the contract. The offer was enough to pay the bank. It was also low enough to make Everett rich within 2 foaling seasons. What happens to Ash? She asked. He is dangerous. I'll have him destroyed. From the bedroom window, Ruth heard every word. She dressed slowly, ignoring the pain in her hip. By the time she reached the porch, Clara was still holding the pen. Ruth looked at the contract, then at the snow along the corrals. Sell 12 geldings, she said. Everett laughed. No buyer will cover the note with 12. Not at ordinary prices. Clara turned to her. Ruth continued. The territorial cavalry buyer is due in Raton next month. He needs quiet mounts that load into rail cars, stand for gunfire, and recover fast from noise. Mesa Verde has 19 that fit. Everett's face hardened. You cannot certify military remounts. No, but Dr. Salazar can test them, and the quartermaster can. The banker looked interested. Ruth placed one hand on the porch rail. Keep the mares, keep the foals. Sell trained geldings at remount price, not breeding stock at panic price. Clara asked, how do you know what the cavalry is paying? I spent 9 years in remount yards. Everett stepped close. You are gambling her ranch on a month-old rumor. Ruth met his eyes. I read the order in the depot office 3 weeks ago. The banker asked, how many animals can you have ready? 19 sound candidates, 15 likely to pass. 12 would cover the winter note and roof. Clara did the figures in her head. For the first time in months, the numbers did not end in loss. Everett reached for the contract. Clara tore it in half. The banker smiled despite himself. Everett did not. He pointed at Ruth. "When those horses fail, she will be gone before you lose the place." Ruth answered quietly, "I came back to stop leaving." The next 4 weeks became the hardest work Mesa Verde had done in years. Ruth trained from the ground while her hip healed. She taught horses to walk across hollow planks, stand beside flapping canvas, load into narrow stock cars, and recover from sudden noise without being punished for the first fear. She never tried to make them fearless. "Fear keeps a horse alive," she told Nell. "The question is whether fear gets the last word." Dr. Mateo Salazar examined teeth, lungs, legs, and eyes. 6 animals were rejected. 13 passed his first standard. Ruth added 2 more after correcting hoof balance and treating an old saddle sore. 15 horses went to Raton. At the rail yard, the quartermaster fired a revolver into the air. 3 mounts spun, 2 pulled back, all recovered within seconds. Ash stood at the end of the line without a rope tied to him. He was not for sale. Ruth had brought him only to steady the younger horses. When the canvas snapped in the wind, Ash looked at Ruth. She breathed. He lowered his head. The quartermaster watched the exchange. "Who trained that stallion?" Ruth nodded toward the horse. "He did most of it." The man bought all 15 geldings at a price 40% higher than Everett's offer per head. Mesa Verde paid the winter note, bought hay, repaired the roof, and kept every foundation mare. That should have been the end of it. But Clara had one debt left, not to the bank. To the woman whose work had held the ranch together long before Clara knew her name. On the first clear Sunday after the sale, Clara asked every ranch hand to gather in the training yard. The banker came, so did Dr. Salazar, the feed merchant, and 3 neighboring breeders who had heard what happened in Raton. Ruth arrived last, walking with a cane she hated. She stopped when she saw the cedar box on a table beside Clara. Clara opened the oldest ledger. "My grandfather's handwriting fills these books," she said. "But the best ideas in them belong to someone else." Everett stood beyond the fence. He had come to collect his final wages. Clara lifted one of the training sheets. "For 37 years, this ranch sold horses praised for calm minds and steady feet. We called it Mesa Verde breeding. We called it family judgment. We called it luck." She looked at Ruth. It was not luck. The yard went still. These horses were raised in a language Ruth Calder built here in 1871. Approach, breathe, wait, ask. The 3-note call our wranglers used to bring the herd home was hers. The mare lines that carried our reputation were chosen by her. The methods that saved this ranch last month were hers. Ruth's eyes dropped to the ledger. Clara continued. 26 horses in our current herd descend directly from the 2 mares she selected. 19 more were trained by people who inherited her system. Across 37 years, that work produced more than 100 sale horses, remounts, broodmares, and ranch mounts. The number moved through the crowd like wind through grass. Not a miracle, a lifetime of consequences. Clara stepped down from the porch. "I cannot give back the years when no one spoke your name." Ruth's mouth tightened. "But I can make sure we never profit from forgetting it again." She handed Ruth a new brass plate. Mesa Verde Calder School Quiet Hand Horse Training below it was a smaller line. Ruth Calder, founding trainer Clara, then offered a second paper. It was not charity. It granted Ruth a permanent home at Mesa Verde, wages equal to the foreman's, and a share from every horse trained under her system. Ruth read the page twice. Everett gave a bitter laugh from the fence. "You are making an old drifter a partner." Clara looked at him. "No." She turned toward Ruth. "I'm correcting the books." Everett left before anyone answered. Nell ran to Ruth and wrapped both arms around her waist, careful of the bruised hip. "Does this mean you stay?" Ruth looked past the girl toward the pasture. "I have been trying to come back for 37 years. Is that a yes?" Ruth smiled. "That is a yes." The brass plate was fixed above the training barn before sundown. Ruth insisted on driving the last nail herself. Then she walked to the lower pasture, where fresh snow lay in white ribbons between the grass. Ash stood a quarter-mile away with Capitan and the broodmares. Ruth did not call them. She rested both hands on the fence and watched. One mare lifted her head. Capitan turned. Ash came last. The horses crossed the pasture slowly, leaving dark tracks through the snow. They gathered along the fence until Ruth stood inside a wall of warm breath and quiet eyes. Nell came beside her. "Do they remember you now?" Ruth touched the brass whistle at her chest. "No." Nell looked disappointed. Ruth nodded toward the herd. "They remember the language." She raised 2 fingers. Ash stepped back. She lowered her hand. He came forward and rested his forehead against hers. For decades, Mesa Verde had carried Ruth Calder's work without carrying her name. The ranch had taught the horses her language. In the end, the horses taught the ranch her name.